The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and happy Thursday. I'm Devin Garbus, the awesome sales guy here at Soaring Eagle. And if anybody is joining this webinar who isn't familiar with us, we are a completely onshore senior to guru level database consulting firm that also specializes in 24/7 managed services. Our CEO, Jeff Garbus, is going to be presenting today. He is a DBA with over 30 years experience himself, has written 20 books on Sybase and SQL Server database management, and is an all-around great guy to know if you're doing anything in the database space. What we're going to be talking about today are a lot of the critical tasks that get overlooked in organizations big and small, which is why we've titled our webinar, What Your DBA Should Be Doing, but Probably Isn't. So Jeff, please feel free to take it away and teach everybody here about all those tasks that they may or may not be forgetting.
Thank you for the introduction, Devin. Good afternoon and welcome to my webinar. When we talk about what a DBA does, this webinar really is targeted towards C-level execs who do not have a lot of exposure to databases or business owners who are wondering whether DBAs always have their hair on fire and are running very reactively. So we'll talk a little bit about what they're doing, how to move from the reactive to the proactive, and give you an insight into what they do on a day-to-day basis. So from a practical perspective, what your DBA should be doing is a few things. From high level, we've got managing your environment. So the DBA makes sure the lights are on, make sure things are up and running smoothly, make sure that the preventive maintenance is working, make sure things are performing well. Now, the DBA does not always have control over whether things are performing well, but the DBA should be able to identify a performance issue, highlight it, get to the root cause, and show you what's going on. DBA should also be doing some monitoring. Now, from a monitoring perspective, most shops really are 24/7. Even shops that are primarily 8/5 have things that go on overnight and on weekends. That might be maintenance, it might be batch processing, it might be reports, might be billing, might be rebuilding indexes and other types of jobs. So we need to know what's going on with the server, and if we're overloading the server while we're doing things like backups, we need to know about that so we can make sure our backups are getting done. Finally, a good DBA team and or a senior or principal level DBA will also take part in things like projections, predictive analysis, planning, saying, right now we are running on a version of the operating system or a version of the server that is going to be out of support in about 2 years. Well, we need to start planning now to make sure that we are on the right path. Or we're going to be running disk space in about 3 months. I know you need a 60-day window to order more storage. Guess what? It's time to get that on your agenda. So from a high level, and I'm not going over every one of these tasks. This really is a list to tell you here is a partial thing that your DBAs are paying attention to. And if you want to go back and look at this, feel free to ask for a copy of this presentation, either via email or I suspect the attendees will be sent this out automatically if you want to review this presentation once this is up on our YouTube channel. Here's a list of things that DBAs do. This is a partial list. This has everything to do with everything from securing your data, taking care of your data, making sure you can restore backups, all the auditing things that are happening on a daily basis or annual basis, depending on your organization's level of paranoia and or your security personnel's level of paranoia. And I use paranoia as a respectful word, by the way, in the database arena. I do have one customer that has literally 12 audits a year. They're a quasi-governmental financial agency. They built entire systems around the auditing. You may not have that level, but your DBAs certainly have things they need to plan for. One of the other things that we notice is that DBAs are typically overworked. And by typically, I mean that it is unusual for me to go into a shop and I go into a different shop of DBAs 2 to 3 times a month, and I've been doing this for almost 30 years. And it's very unusual for DBAs to work 40-hour weeks. It's very unusual for them not to put in some evenings and weekends. It's very unusual for them not to get calls when they're out to dinner or on a vacation or at an event with their kids. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that is so and what types of things they're working on, what sorts of things are running. By the way, this is going to be about a half-hour presentation. This is not targeted for a full hour. I do sometimes talk a little fast, and I'll apologize in advance for that, but I do want to try to get through as much of the material as possible before we get to the end. So on a bad day, DBAs tend to be focused on reactive things. Reactive things are in the category of, hey, things are running slowly, how come? Or we've run out of space, or we accidentally dropped a table, or we had a rollout yesterday and over the course of the day things were running slowly, but we're only telling you about this now and we want you to fix it before the rest of the day moves any further. So DBAs are frequently hit with a variety of tasks which have to be done right now. Because there are so many right now tasks, it can be difficult to focus on the things that have to happen on a continuous basis. And we'll talk about things like maintenance plans, and we'll talk about things like making sure backups are restorable. But the frequent firefighting nature of the operational DBA is one of those things which do occasionally prevent their ability to sit back and build a plan. There are two types of DBAs, at least I will classify two types of DBAs. That is a production DBA and a development DBA. For quick definitions, a production DBA is the person who's responsible for the system from the time it rolls into production until forever. So that includes everything from making sure the lights are on, it's performing well, all the preventive maintenance is being performed, all the users are happy, we have adequate hardware, the hardware and the operating system and the databases are all on supported versions and are relatively recent and have plenty of capacity. The development DBA is the person who sets things up so that the production DBA is not surprised. So they should be communicating well. The development DBA will work with your application team, will help with database design, will help with performance, will help with index selection, will help with architecture. Sometimes there's an overlap between production and development DBA, but they really are different job descriptions and honestly different abilities. It is useful but not usual to have a DBA who is able to do both well. Typically that's not a DBA who's been around 5 years. Typically it's been a DBA who's been around 15 or 20 or 25. This presentation does focus on the production DBAs. So when the production DBA is not doing his or her job, we need to make sure these servers are properly maintained. There's a lot of preventive maintenance that goes into any kind of server, whether it be SQL Server, Oracle, Sybase, Informix, MySQL, you name it. When we don't do this, performance degrades, you have potential issues with database consistency. Database consistency, for those of you who are not into the technical babble, means that you can have corruption in your databases, and this is something that we need to make sure does not happen. Cleanup of the ancillary processes. What does that mean? Well, when we do a backup, that backup goes someplace. What happens if we don't age them out and delete some of them? Well, we're going to use up our space. Lack of preventive maintenance is probably the one thing that creates errors and problems in most shops. Things like not rebuilding indexes causes not only progressive performance problems, but also potentially increases chances of corruption because of the extra work the optimizer and or the DBMS need to perform in order to get there from here. Things like statistics need to be kept up to date. Oracle does finally have a cost-based optimizer, although they don't always recommend using it. Most of the other major DBMSs do have cost-based optimizers, and what that means is when you run a query, The optimizer is the portion of the DBMS that asks the question, what index do I use? What join order do I use? How do I resolve the query? And in order to do that, it needs to understand the layout of the data. So, for example, if I have a column that I'm looking at, which is gender, and I've got just male and female in there, which is a typical approach, although different cities and different organizations have far more genders than they list. If I'm going to pick male or female in that situation, then I'm going after roughly half the data. What if I have a column on IDs, primary keys? Well, those are typically going to be unique. So the difference between the level of uniqueness and going after a large percent of the table, very, very relevant for the optimizer. And we need to perform preventive maintenance for the purpose of making sure the optimizer knows what the organizational layout of the data is. So from a minimum perspective, what we need to, on each SQL server, perform is index maintenance, and that index maintenance needs to be performed on every index on every server. I was at a client site just last week where they had 140 servers with about 32 terabytes of databases on each, and every one of those indexes needs to be addressed to make sure that the index maintenance does not get out of whack. Out of whack being one of my technical terms. The database needs to be checked for consistency. A variety of things need to be cleaned up. Backups need to be not only performed, but tested. One of the questions I will ask a DBA prospect is, how do you validate that your backup worked? And if I don't get an answer along the lines of, well, we tested it, then I do worry about the general level of competence of the DBA. A senior DBA would almost always say, I tested in a new environment. So not only do we have the preventive maintenance, but if you're doing that across 140 servers, we also need the ability and the tools to bring that information back and ask the question, did every incremental backup work? If I have 20 databases on each of 140 servers, I've got several hundred databases, and I need to know that every single incremental backup ran. We'll talk about tools in just a minute. While we're talking about backups, though, one of the questions I get from DBAs, and I've been teaching DBAs for almost 30 years, so I get a lot of questions from DBAs because they know I have an opinion about almost everything. Backup decisions are not technical decisions. Backup decisions are business decisions. So the question is, to what point in time do I need to restore? And I do have customers that will look at the business cost of a restore and say, you know what? All I really care about is make sure you can restore to last night's backup, do a daily backup, and we're good. If I lose a day's worth of information, well, I have ways of getting that information back. That does tend to be the unusual case. In things like financial transactions and things like claims processing and things like internet commerce, e-commerce processing, we can't afford to lose a transaction. So we're going to take backups more frequently. We're going to take incremental backups. We're going to make sure we can restore to a point in time in case we had some sort of a malicious attack, and we need to make sure that we can restore to 3:03 p.m. We're going to make sure that we have great failover capabilities, and that, by the way, is going to be something which is likely designed by your development DBA and implemented and managed by your production DBA. This has to do with everything from service level to the cost of the service. From a performance perspective, very important for us to be able to ask the question, are we performing well? And that really is an interesting question in and of itself. How do you define performance? Is it, I don't have anybody calling me and complaining? Is it, I can fit everything into my batch window? Is it the queries are responding well enough? Is it I have 300 telemarketers all running through their systems and I don't have any delay when the next phone call hits? Defining performance can be one of the cues to look at it. So one of the things that your DBA spends a good bit of his or her time doing is dealing with performance issues and trying to do the math and doing things like cost justifying, picking up your older SAN and dropping the data into a flash-based system and or fill in the blank depending on the problem he or she is trying to solve. By the numbers, and this is a really interesting slide, these numbers come from Microsoft, they come from Gartner Group, they come from Forrester Group. Some of them are over a couple of years old, but my experience is that these numbers have been the same for 20 years. So from the smaller number to the bigger number, when you have problems that you're trying to solve, and this is a lot of what your DBA is spending his time doing, just getting to the right person takes a lot of telephone calls. IT in general spends about a quarter of its time addressing performance-related issues. And by the way, this is one of the reasons I love tools, because if the tool can get to the root cause of a problem relatively quickly, you can eliminate a lot of that 24% of your load. So if a tool can give you back an additional quarter of your staff, that's a very valuable tool. Load testing. A lot of shops have very detailed load plans. They have a lot of testers. They have a lot of QA folks. I'm going to share with you something that was shared with me, not under non-disclosure, but over a beer when I was talking to a senior person at a load testing software company. They said that on a good day, they're going to pick up 30% of performance problems before they get into production. From my perspective, if I were the CIO or CTO, I would ask why in the world I'm spending so much money on the load testing software if I'm only picking up a third of the problems. But that's just me, because I know how to solve the problems. And if I'm going to solve 60% of them, I might as well resolve them all relatively quickly. This number was from Microsoft. 70% of performance problems are caused by source code, not infrastructure. Now, by the time I get into things, what I find is that a lot of the time there are code problems or architecture problems which are putting unnecessary strains on hardware. So those strains end up looking like hardware problems, and as a result, sometimes C-level folks solve the hardware problem without looking at the underlying code. So if you've got bad indexing and what it's doing is stressing your storage, you spend the money on the faster storage, but that tends to mask the problem and not solve it, and it tends to get worse until that faster storage is also getting crushed. So we do like looking at the underlying problems. 73% of performance problems first reported by business users. What that's telling us is that the people who are using the systems are the one complaining. We're not identifying a lot of them via our own tools, which would be nice to have. And finally, 80% of the mean time to resolution is simply spent identifying the underlying cause of the problem. Once again, if we take 80% of that 24%, we get 20% of our staff time back if 4% of that is fixing it and 20% of that is identifying the root cause. I do strongly recommend spending dedicated time on performance and getting proactive about it. This is one of the things we do as part of our managed service, and this is one of the things I'm always asked to do when I come in as a contract DBA, which are generally short-term performance and tuning issues. I only have about 11 minutes left, and I have about 30 slides, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over the case studies, but let's just say that improving your performance makes people happy. As far as proper monitoring tools go, there are a few that we like a lot, and if anybody's interested in tools, I'd recommend just reach out and call or email. I'm available to chat with anybody about anything. Flight has our own internal tool. It is used for managing thousands of DBMSs with tens of thousands of databases on them, bringing the information back to a dashboard and using some machine intelligence to ask the question, is everything going all right? SQL Governor is a product that we resell that looks at hundreds of servers and asks the question, do you really need hundreds of servers? Should we be combining some of these? Are we wasting some of the storage? Are we wasting some of the processing power? And can we effectively reduce the cost of our footprint? And by the way, let's take a look at performance and graph it and use machine learning to try to determine what's on first, who's on first, what's on second. Redgate has a great suite of tools on the SQL Server side for management. DBA is a database performance analyzer, which runs by SolarWinds. We spend a lot of time looking at software, and we have a lot of experience in our customers' environments with what software tools tend to work and which ones tend to become shelfware. I invite you to pick our brains about it. So, not going to spend a huge amount of time on solving the problem. Identify the root cause and then solve the underlying problem as opposed to throwing hardware at it. Very critical to anything that goes on in the performance area. On the performance side, we've got a lot of hardware restrictions. We have the need to look at the server configuration, look at the queries. A lot of what your DBA does is take a look at this big picture and identify where things can be fixed, where they need to be fixed. I do like tools a lot because even though over my first 15 years or so with SQL Server, Sybase, you name it, I wrote my own tools. I always brought scripts with me. Now, honestly, I keep those scripts on my blog site, and you're welcome to borrow those, steal them, modify them, tell me there's a better way. Generally, I bring a tool with me because the tool allows me to take a look at things over time. Very useful thing. If your DBAs do not have tools, you should be buying tools for your DBAs. Things to have tools for, identifying where the problem is, what it is. There are things that you really need to look for over time that it's hard to do without a tool because you have to sit and watch it. But with the tool, what you're going to end up being able to do is ask the question, gee, this is a problem now. Was it a problem an hour ago? Did something change? People are calling at 2 in the afternoon and asking the question, what was going on this morning? Everything was slow. Well, why didn't you tell me this morning? Well, we were busy dealing with it. We didn't have time to tell you this morning. So picking up the trending and the ability to do it and identify what queries are busy, what the heavy hitters are, where we should be doing the modification, what we need to be picking up. Is it just an issue of too much data? Great. The other good thing a tool for is validation. One of the things we end up doing a lot are making changes to the system. We need to be able to ask the question, did we have a positive effect? And we need to be able to quantify the answer. If we're not able to do this, we simply don't know if we had a positive effect or if we're throwing spaghetti up against the wall. And a tool helps us pick that information up. Note that your DBAs are often, I'm looking for a politically correct way of saying this, and I'm not sure there is one. If you're in a financial organization and you've got DBAs that have been with you for 20 years, those people have 20 years of experience working as a DBA in a financial world. They haven't looked at a lot of other worlds, and they don't have the breadth of experience that other people have. One of the things that I do encourage people to do is get a second look, an outside pair of eyes from somebody who's not looking at things exactly the way your group is. Good DBAs are frequently, and I'll talk about personality attributes of a great DBA shortly, but the DBAs are frequently on forums. They're doing research. They're looking to see what their friends are doing. They're going to user groups and talking to user communities and asking the question, have you run into this? Is there a better way of doing that? We're going to start archiving your data. What have you run into? What happens when I use partitions? What happens when I don't? What happens when I can't afford the downtime? How do I minimize locking? The great DBA is also doing a lot of scanning, predictability, asking the question, when am I going to run out of space? When am I going to run out of CPU? And have we adequately planned for it? One of the things we very frequently see with DBAs is that DBAs tend to be people who make database administration their life. And they will come in early, they will leave late, they will work evenings from home, they'll work weekends. And many of them simply love it. I do have DBAs I work with who don't take vacations, who work crazy hours. And when I say, hey, why don't you take a vacation and get some rest? They say, what did I do to tick you off? Don't you like me anymore? I love what I'm doing. Those are the exceptions. Most people, when they're working 60-hour weeks, at some point say, I need to spend time with my spouse and children. They say, I need a vacation. They say, I need, you name it. There are lots of environments that I walk into, and I would say probably 60+% where the DBAs get called on vacation, where they get called overnight, where they get woken up unnecessarily, where they are working 80-hour weeks and don't get the comp time. And shops like that lose their DBAs a lot, and they really don't understand why. If you have a shop like this and you're starting to get worried, do give us a buzz. One of the things our managed services does is give your DBAs their life back. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it here. I will invite you to call us if that is a problem. One of the other things that your DBA spends some time doing is what if analysis. You need to go out and find the practical joker in your group and ask the question, how would you break things if you were being malicious? Now, you will not always find out or know who your practical joker is. I am a huge practical joker, but I never ever do it in a professional environment. But I ask my children what pranks I've pulled on them or friends when I pull on them, and they'll shake their head and say, you wouldn't believe what he did to me. The reason for this is what you're looking for are anomalies. What you're looking for are things that can go wrong. What you're looking for are, what are my single points of failure and what can I do to circumvent those? That DR plan, by the way, is something that needs to be put in writing and tested by somebody who did not put that plan together, just to make sure that there aren't any holes in it and that it works. I mentioned I'd talk about personality attributes of the great DBA. The great DBA is always learning, always checking the forums, always talking, is meticulous, very detail-oriented, and anal retentive, compulsive, neurotic. The great DBA is proactive, is a professional paranoid. I told my accountant once, he said, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm a professional paranoid. He said, I can't put that on your tax return. I said, why not? The great DBA automates everything, especially the monitoring. The great DBA is a great communicator. You can be a good DBA and a senior DBA without being a communicator. But the great DBA is always letting management know what's going on, is working with the development teams, is working with QA, is trying to educate the developers on the team and teaching them how to code a little better or things that they didn't already know. And finally, the great DBA, well, Scrum is the wrong word, but they're in a continual improvement process on a very, very frequent basis. Things that can cause your technical resource deficiencies. This is another question. When a C-level person is asking, what is my DBA doing? Frequently there's a problem and he's wondering why, or she is wondering why the DBA hasn't addressed it yet. Here are some of those problems and why they're running into. Number one is always defensive turf. The DBA does not want to say, I don't know, and ask for help. The DBA wants to say, I got this, I will take care of it, just give me the space. And sometimes your DBAs can do that, and sometimes they really need to take a lateral step and say, you know what, I'm stumped. I will get to this eventually, but if you need something fast, reach out and grab somebody. Identification of resources is frequently a problem. I had a client who had interviewed no less than 120 DBAs, wasn't able to find the right candidate. Now, I suspect that their screening process went back to bullet number one, defensive turf, and they were a little bit too picky, but that's one of the other things that a good DBA can help you with. Depth and breadth of knowledge. People don't always know what their options are. And finally, you may have a DBA as a single point of failure. What happens when you have only one DBA? I'll give you a hint. You get a very high turnover rate when you're not expecting it. Summary. Your DBA is a very busy camper. Refer to that list on a very much earlier page. At this point, I will handle any questions. I think I've come in at almost exactly a half an hour, and I will now open up the questions to see if anybody has any.
I'm not seeing any questions, so we will put this presentation up, available to download, as well as this video onto YouTube, so you can come back and reference it and share it with the rest of your team. Thank you so much for everybody for coming. Thank you for the comments, John. We appreciate it, and always stick around to our LinkedIn and our website so you'll know when our next webinar is. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all.